Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell, and welcome back. We are back live with news and views on January the 8th, 2015. And we had a little vacation for the last 2 weeks, and 2015, unfortunately, has started off with a bang, and we'll get to that in a moment. But I want to take care of a couple of announcements first. I want to talk about Georgianne Hughes. I have not heard anything more from her son. So I have no new information to update you there on what the situation is with her. Second announcement I want to make is it's been many years since Daniel and I changed over the website to the new format. It's been about 5 years. And we looked at the books this last year and decided that it's time to take down our donation button. So what we've done is we've modified the donation button so that now you can simply target, if you decide to make donations. We prefer people to spread the word about the website, get more members to the website, but we have modified the donation button so that you can target specific areas, and that will help us do things. Eventually we want to get rid of it altogether, but we've taken it down from the blanket donation button because we think it's time. I do want to thank all of you. There's a very dear lady, you know who you are. There's a gentleman, a few gentlemen, and some other people that have made some really, really kind donations in the past 5 years that have helped us keep going, and we want to thank you for that. We're moving on. Hopefully, as we continue to grow, if we continue to grow, we won't have to put that donation button, the blanket donation, back up. But now you can at least target what you want things to do, because Daniel and I have decided that we need to expand some of our capabilities on the website anyway. So those are my two announcements. Now let's get down to the news and my typical high-octane speculation of the day. I want to start out with an article that appeared on RT, Russia Today, on January 5th. This is not too long ago, 3 days ago, and another article that appeared on MSNBC. And I want to indulge in my high-octane speculation because there's something going on here. I can feel it. My high-octane speculation may not be the same as yours, and there's any number of ways to read the situation if you want to indulge in this kind of dot connecting between these two events. RT ran a story on January 5th, 2015, titled "Russia Sanctions, quote, must be lifted now," unquote. And then they're citing French President Francois Hollande, all right? And let me read a couple of things from this article that really got me thinking. The first thing that the article states is a quotation from President Hollande to this effect. Quote, "If Russia has a crisis, it is not necessarily good for Europe," Hollande said during a 2-hour interview with radio station France Inter. Quote, "I'm not for the policy of attaining goals by making things worse. I think that sanctions must stop now," unquote. And then beneath this, there's a linked article in RT. I'll put these links up for you so that you can look at them. But there's a linked article that has the headline, "More Russia Sanctions to Provoke Dangerous Situation in Europe," and that's a statement from the German Vice Chancellor. Now, continuing on down in the RT article, there's a further statement that is referenced by the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, and that states, quote, "He has sarcastically described Western sanctions, also announced in September, as, quote, a reward for Russia's role in the Minsk agreements and more generally for its part in organizing the meeting," unquote. And reward there is in quotation marks. And then even further in this article, another very interesting statement from President Hollande of France. Quote, "Mr. Putin does not want to annex the eastern Ukraine. I am sure. He told me so," unquote, Hollande told France Inter. Quote, what he wants is to remain influential. What Mr. Putin wants is that Ukraine does not become a member of NATO. The idea of Mr. Putin is not to have an army at Russia's borders, and you can't blame him. That's rather obvious as to why. Then the article goes on to state this, and listen very carefully. The Ukrainian crisis has strained relations between Russia and France, with Paris putting on hold the delivery of the Mistral helicopter-carrying amphibious assault ships to Moscow. Hollande decided to suspend the delivery of the first ship, quote, until further notice, unquote, in late last November, despite the fact that the move might hit the French economy hard. France is facing a multi-billion-dollar fine if it fails to deliver the ships under the terms of the contract. The delay of the warship's delivery has also reportedly entailed additional costs for Paris, unquote. Now, that's the Russia Today story. And then, of course, 2 days later, what happened? We had the Paris gunman killing people in a French satirical magazine, all right? And I want to read you this story from MSN.com, and I'll link this article to you. And there are a number of statements in this article that also give me pause, and these statements are the statements that led me to kind of connect the two events. In other words, I think the gunning of the Paris satirical magazine and President Hollande's statements about lifting sanctions against Russia are related. Listen carefully. Quote, with calm, cold determination and deadly efficiency of the gunman who attacked a French satirical magazine on Wednesday, leaving 12 people dead, has led police to believe they received military-style training. Images of the attack on Charlie Hebdo offices taken on cell phones show a carefully planned and professional operation, said a former bodyguard and policeman speaking on condition of anonymity. Quote, it is obvious from the way they hold their guns and proceed calmly and coldly. They certainly received some kind of military training, unquote, said another police officer. And they're not identifying in this particular article who these police officers are. If they're Americans, if they're French police officers, I would rather suspect that even if they aren't French police officers, that these things would have been immediately apparent to the police in Paris and probably to the French Sûreté. So I do think that France is definitely under the understanding that this was a carefully planned, orchestrated operation, all right? So bear that in mind and let me continue. Quote, they weren't acting on the spur of the moment, unquote. In particular, he pointed to the way they held their Kalashnikov rifles close to their bodies, firing off shot by shot instead of a burst of gunfire, saying this showed they knew how to use the weapon. The former bodyguard said, quote, the most striking thing is their cold-bloodedness. They were trained in Syria, in Iraq, or elsewhere, maybe even in France, but one thing is sure, they were trained, unquote. Another sign of the killer's sang-froid was seen as they struggled to find their target, first stopping at the wrong address. They didn't lose it and start firing. They kept on to the headquarters of Charlie Hebdo. All right, unquote. Now, what I think is going on here is that these two events, Hollande's statements about lifting sanctions and this event, may be related. And here's why. I think the key here is the statements that these guys were trained and the suggestion that they were trained in Syria or Iraq. And that means that somebody is trying to pin the blame on Islamic terrorists, on Islamic fundamentalism, and so on. And that, to me, is a key warning sign that that act may not be true, that that may be a bit of a false flag. It may be a bit of disinformation. Let me explain why. As many of you know, I've been tracking the relationship of radical Islam to the West over many years, and specifically to Nazism, but I'm not blaming the Nazi International on this one. But it is clear that this attack had organization, planning, and training. And this has to come from somewhere, and ultimately it has to come from somebody with great power backing. Somebody, in other words, in my opinion, was sending a message to France, and specifically to President Hollande, without trying to look like they're sending a message. So in other words, it's going to look one way to the public, and it's going to look another way to President Hollande and his intelligence services. And that, I think, is key. And the warning here is that they do not want Hollande to go along or lead any charge in Europe to lift the sanctions. Now, I think this is crucial because Hollande is, by making those statements, I think voicing the opinion of a great many Europeans, not just inside France, but elsewhere in Europe. The sanctions are not helping France. The sanctions are not helping Europe. Ultimately, had Germany been the country calling for an end to the sanctions, I think everybody would have dismissed that. In other words, Germany would have been seen as playing its usual typical diplomatic game of playing off East against West. And that's a very, very old German game. But when it comes from France, this is a very, very different matter, because France, like the United Kingdom, is one of Europe's two thermonuclear powers. So in other words, I think this was a message, and it may have been, in my opinion, my high-octane speculation of the day, I think this may have been a message that was designed in the West. So in other words, deeply, at some deep level, you have the probable involvement or possible involvement of British or American, possibly both, intelligence services in the planning and execution of this event. Now, I'm not certain on this because, again, we don't know all the facts about this story. There may be things that the French police are going to uncover that would eventually deny this, but I cannot help but think that two such events in such close proximity were unrelated. Now, some people may object and say that the events were too close and with planning involved. It may have been something that was in the works before Hollande made his statements, and therefore they are unrelated. But I think, again, that that's not looking at things carefully enough, because if Hollande was prepared to make those statements, then word was getting out in France behind the scenes that Monsieur Hollande was about ready to make a major policy statement. So in other words, I don't think that we can argue that these events are unrelated simply because they're too close in proximity. I think the planning, as word broke out, began to stage something and send a message to France. It's going to be very, very interesting because there's another story that appeared that I don't have time to talk about in today's News and Views, that the Ukraine is blaming Russia for recent cyber attacks on German government websites. Now, again, that's to be expected because the Ukraine is basically a puppet fascist government that was installed by the United States through covert operations. So they're trying, somebody's trying real hard, in other words, is my point here, somebody's trying real hard to keep Europe firmly within the NATO Atlantic Alliance community, even though economically it doesn't really benefit Europe, and ultimately, even militarily, it doesn't really benefit Europe. So we're beginning, in my opinion, to see the hard evidence that there is a real struggle going on behind the scenes to keep Europe firmly cemented within the NATO Atlantic community. And like I've been arguing, I think ultimately this is going to fail. But it's going to be an interesting year to watch diplomatically. As I indicated earlier, France is a key country to watch, and now we're seeing indicators that in France they're not entirely happy with the way that the West has imposed sanctions and so on. So, interesting year, folks. That's it for my News and Views this week. I'll see you on the flip side, everybody. God bless.